Skipping straight to dessert? Well, Halloween is all about the junk food. Welcome to the first TurboWorks Gaiden episode. Although I've chosen to center TurboWorks on the American TurboGrafx and Duo lineups, the whole thing about this platform is that most of the good stuff never came to the US. And where better to begin this side excursion into the PC Engine side of things in Japan than with the most infamous game never to see official localization for the system, Dracula X Rondo of Blood, which we would have called Castlevania Dracula X if it had actually shipped here. This is by far the most famous and infamous of all releases for the PC Engine, or more precisely, the CD-ROM-ROM. A fantastic entry in a long-running series for a console that didn't actually see many existing game properties, outside of things that Hudson had a connection to, that fed directly into the most beloved entry in that franchise, and which wasn't released in the US. How could Rondo of Blood be anything less than a legend? I know that I certainly saw a flood of questions asking if I'd be talking about this game the instant I kicked off TurboWorks, and just as many people asking why Rondo never had an American release. The answer to that first question is yes, obviously. As for the second question, well, it's fair, but I feel like that also has a pretty obvious answer. Rondo seems like it should have been a shoo-in for localization. After all, the Castlevania series has never been as popular back in Japan as it is here. And my impression has always been that the games largely survived on the back of their overseas popularity rather than any particular devotion in the domestic Japanese market. But the flip side of that coin is that the PC Engine was a hell of a lot more popular in Japan than the TurboGrafx 16 was in the US. I don't need to flog that particular point of discussion any further though. I spent plenty of time mulling the TurboGrafx 16's challenges in the early episodes of TurboWorks. The disparate popularity in the hardware between regions almost certainly killed any prospect of Rondo seeing an English release. By the time Rondo arrived in Japan in October 1993, the Turbo platforms had run their course here in the US. NEC had more or less washed its hands of the TurboGrafx 16 back in 1991, since its NEC's Technologies division had done a Tonka and failed to carve out a satisfactorily large niche for the console versus its competition. NEC established a spin-off company that put more responsibility for the system on Hudson's shoulders, Turbo Technologies Inc., and allowed TTI to take the lead. Although TTI's marketing efforts included some baffling missteps, like the massively derided Johnny Turbo comics, on the whole, TTI decided to focus on the Turbo Duo hybrid console and pitch it to an older audience than Sega and Nintendo's core base of tweens and teens. Again, that would make Rondo seem like the perfect flagship title, being a CD-based game with fairly mature themes and challenging gameplay. Alas, if only Rondo had showed up earlier in Japan. Going by release date listings on NEC Retro, the final US releases for any Turbo format were Shockman and Magical Chase, which shipped in July or August of 1993. If you are good at calendars, you will instantly realize that the Turbo's end of life predates the October 1993 release of Rondo for PC Engine by several months. Now consider also the fact that Rondo contained a modest amount of text and a healthy chunk of voice acting. And then consider that localization on TurboGrafx 16 tended to lag behind Japanese releases a fair amount, sometimes by a year. The console arrived here 2 years later than in Japan, and localizations never quite closed that time gap, no doubt due to the thin margins and small teams that define the American version of the system. Realistically, I don't think Rondo would have seen a US release until well into 1994, a good year after the last guy out the door had turned off the lights and locked the doors on Turbo manufacturing. And no, they couldn't have just released the game without an English dub. That kind of thing absolutely did not fly in the US in the mid-90s. Reading a cartoon or a video game in the 90s? Impossible. So the simple fact is that there was no path to localization for Rondo of Blood back in the day. If you people really wanted it so badly, you should have bought a couple million more TurboGrafx systems. The inaccessible nature of Rondo of Blood in the years before emulation and cheap imports turned it into a thing of pure legend, especially once Americans came to understand that the prologue in Symphony of the Night was a reprise of this game, despite bizarrely citing Bloodlines. The greatest Castlevania game of all time, we were promised by both the internet and frothy import-obsessed magazines. denied to stupid Americans by the cruel monsters at Konami, nearly impossible to play, the greatest travesty of unlocalization known to history. In some respects, we live in a kinder, gentler world today. There are many ways to play Rondo of Blood now, even if you live in the United States. No longer the benighted states now that we have access to Rondo. The footage I've recorded in this episode over the years came from no less than 5 different setups. Super graphics with a Super SD System 3, an actual Turbo Duo running the original game disc, a TurboGrafx 16 with EverDrive, a MiSTer FPGA, courtesy of MiSTer Add-Ons, and the Analog Duo review unit I received from Analog a few years back. And those are just the mechanisms that approximate the original game experience, playing on a TV and all. You can also play the game and its remake on PSP or on PlayStation 4. And if you were one of the cool kids with the perspicacity to shop Wii Virtual Console back in the day, you probably still have that chunk of code in memory. You could also play Dracula X for Super NES via the Castlevania Advance Collection for modern platforms. That's a little like snorting rat poison when you're jonesing for a snootful of premium cocaine. So the mystique has at last been peeled away. No illusions, only game. In that light, is Akumajo Dracula Chino Rondo really that good? Well, yeah, it is. Maybe not the absolute best Castlevania they've ever made, but an actual masterpiece that stitches together the series' 2 schools of design. It's a confident, sophisticated piece of software. It ties together the totality of Castlevania games that came before it, but never feels like it simply settles for being referential. It pushes the series into new spaces, while feeling respectful of established precedent. It puts a new narrative twist on the series, elevating it at long last beyond, hey, let's kill the Universal movie monster pantheon, and shaping the direction of the next 15 years of Castlevania games. It makes great use of the CD format to bring new sophistication to the series, without drifting into the tech for tech's sake, regardless of its impact on gameplay, territory that tripped up Super Castlevania 4 at times. It's difficult without feeling unreasonably punishing the way Haunted Castle or Chronicles for X68000 did. It introduces a heavy emphasis on exploration and alternate pathing without going full aimless open world like Castlevania 2. It allows you to play as multiple characters without diminishing the main Belmont guy the way Castlevania 3 sometimes did. What I'm saying is that Rondo of Blood offered players a referendum on the Castlevania series to date, making a final statement on the classic series before its sequel would chart an entirely new direction for the games. Well, okay, Bloodlines was actually more like the final statement there, I guess, but Bloodlines, for all its excellence, still kind of strikes me as a step backward compared to Rondo. Before Symphony of the Night, Castlevania struggled to diverge too far from the model of the original NES game. Simon's Quest is weird and interesting, but toothless. The Game Boy games almost don't feel like Castlevania, and Castlevania 4 looks and plays like no other entry in the series. The Rondo team, led by designer Toru Hagiwara, seemingly took that fact to heart and created something that feels like the next step forward from Castlevania 3. While ostensibly a short, 8-stage game, of which 2 stages amount to little more than boss rushes, Rondo plays out as something much larger and more impressive. Nearly all of the stages feature branching paths that lead to different challenges, alternate bosses, and potentially even hidden stages. This unconventional structure and the game's thematic ties to the past are clear from the outset. Once you complete the interactive prologue, in which the Grim Reaper confronts new protagonist Richter Belmont, several times great-grandson of Simon, en route to the castle via horse-drawn carriage, you make your way through the ruins of Algiba. You may recall Algiba as one of the towns that Simon visited in Castlevania 2, and that's what the signpost at the outskirts of the village depicts. Unlike in Simon's Quest, Algiba here has been set ablaze and overrun with monsters, mostly skeletons, not just the usual bone chuckers, but also gorilla skeletons that chuck barrels, like Donkey Kong, and ninja skeletons that leap through windows and perform sliding kicks toward Richter. The fight through Algiba neatly sums up Rondo's approach to its heritage, cheerfully referencing older games while building on them with new and thematically appropriate elements, and not afraid to take liberties for the sake of a good time. In Simon's Quest, Jova was the abandoned town that sat at the outskirts of Dracula's castle, but here you arrive at the castle's gate once you make your way through the blazing ruins of Algiba. Well, potentially. If you take the obvious route through Stage 1, you'll pass through a residential area, then battle a series of oversized rock golems in the town square, ultimately reaching the castle gates where a wyvern awaits you. However, if you recall your classic Castlevania technique and think to whip walls in order to reveal secrets, you'll find a doozy of a hidden bonus midway through the level. Rather than rewarding you with a shot multiplier or mystical meat slab, Rondo reveals an entire hidden passage. A wall placed in a conspicuously awkward spot crumbles to reveal a room where a one-of-a-kind plant monster lurks. Dropping down leads you to a new branch of the stage where you encounter a completely different boss, a sea serpent, along a bridge. The sea serpent battle is fast and brutally difficult, but surviving it leads you to a different destination than taking on the wyvern. Stage 2 Dash, not the standard Stage 2. It's a more difficult sequence to overcome than the primary Stage 2, taking place along a high bridge. From here on out, every level until you reach Stage 6 offers both a standard and a secret exit, each guarded by a distinct boss. Each Dash stage leads to encounters with the same bosses as you meet in the standard stages, and each boss encounter leads you to either the next stage or its Dash variant. In other words, levels 2 through 4 each have two totally different versions that each fork and intertwine. So you can reach Stage 3 and Stage 3 Dash from either Stage 2 or Stage 2 Dash, depending on which route you take through those stages. It's a little confusing to describe, but it makes sense if you chart it out visually. Really, what it ultimately means is that you have several different possible paths through the game, creating a huge amount of replay value. And since this is a CD-ROM game designed for a system with built-in save tech, this is the first console Castlevania since the disk system titles that allow you to save and load your progress rather than relying on passwords. If you want to retry a stage to find its secrets, all you need to do is return to the world map, a simple affair that visually charts the levels you found and conquered, and select the stage that you want to challenge. And there's plenty to see and do. The main route through the game is very much a classic Castlevania experience. You whip your way through a village, the castle entrance, the cathedral, a dungeon, and for some reason a haunted ship, before arriving at the inner keep and clock tower. It's pretty much a redux of Castlevania and Castlevania 3, minus the long lead-in to the castle proper seen in Dracula's Curse. The Dash route, on the other hand, has more in common with the roundabout course in Castlevania 3, the one where you meet Alucard. The Dash course feels more like a low path, the back route through the castle, with largely water-themed environments. It takes you across rivers, through mountains and cemeteries, and along a crumbling bridge. Again, each standard stage can potentially lead you to the next Dash level, and each Dash level can potentially route you back to the main path. So there are two challenges here, surviving each stage and finding all the routes. You need to explore the entire game in order to get the best possible ending, as Richter has a secondary goal beyond simply defeating Dracula. The vampire's minions have abducted 4 young women to use as ritual sacrifices for their master, and you need to save them to spare them from that dreadful fate. The captive maidens include Richter's fiancée, Annette Renard, and Annette's younger sister, Maria. Annette is the most difficult of the ladies to rescue, while Maria is the easiest, if you know what you're doing. Which is fitting because Maria becomes a playable character once she's been liberated, and her trek through the game is much easier than Richter's. Richter has a lot of moves for a Belmont. He can't wield his whip in 8 directions as Simon could in Castlevania 4, but he can spin his whip quickly to create a sort of shield against projectiles, as well as perform a sliding kick like the skeleton ninjas, and evade enemy attacks with a quick backflip dodge. He also has the ability to perform something called an item crash, where he brandishes his current subweapon and performs an upgraded attack with it at a high cost to his consumable heart tokens. Later games called him the greatest of the Belmonts, and with good reason. But Maria is arguably even greater than the best the Belmont clan has to offer. Her short stature gives her a small hitbox, and she can perform a double jump to better clear difficult gaps or dodge enemies in midair. And rather than wielding weapons, Maria instead fights with animals. Specifically, creatures themed around the Chinese zodiac, but with a cute twist. By default, she throws doves at foes. This might sound a bit meager compared to a holy whip enchanted through blood magic to be especially powerful against the unliving, but you'd be surprised. Not only do Maria's doves do vampire killer tier damage to her foes, she can chuck 2 at a time, and she doesn't have to pause in her forward movement in order to let them loose. And they fly back to her, potentially scoring extra hits on their return flight. Maria's special weapons are similarly themed as if taken from a nursery school version of the Chinese zodiac, and are arguably better than Richter's traditional set of Belmont bonuses, with huge hitboxes and interesting, sometimes almost game-breaking effects. If you manage to save all of these women, you earn the best ending. This is tricky though, because the captives are scattered through both the primary and Dash stages. And it's not simply enough to find them. You also have to find the key to their prison cells, then carry that along with you. Richter and Maria don't have inventories, so the keys take the form of sub-weapons. Except that the keys don't have any real attack properties of their own, and attempting to item crash them will just cause confusion. So transporting them to their destinations is tough, especially Annette's, which is hidden inside a secret lock inside the clock tower. You ever try to make it up a Castlevania clock tower past all those spikes and Medusa heads without a backup weapon? Terrible. Worse, collecting an actual sub-weapon while holding a key will cause the new item to overwrite the key. Thankfully, Rondo implements a new mechanic for sub-weapon acquisition. Picking up a new one will cause you to drop the one you had in hand to the ground, where it sits for a few seconds before fading away, in case you decide you'd rather stick with it. No more accidentally snagging a dagger and losing a triple boomerang. In fact, Rondo lacks shot multipliers altogether, minimizing the number of temporary upgrades you need to worry about in any given life. You want to chuck a bunch of holy water all at once? Well, friend, Richter can do that by default. He is the greatest of the Belmonts, after all. The increased speed and skill and versatility of Rondo's heroes makes this the most approachable Classicvania game. Maria, in particular, feels like a nod toward the more fluid characters that would star in the later Igavania games, thanks to her running combat style and deft aerial skills. This fits perfectly with the stage designs, which also feel like nods toward the Igavania direction the series would take. There are no non-linear spaces here, outside of maybe like the platform elevator loop that you can get caught up in late stage 3, but the branches make for the most sprawling and varied of all the Classicvanias. The alternate routes and hidden paths are integrated more organically into the game than they were in Castlevania 3. You don't simply choose a route in between certain stages. You have to seek out and forge your path, and some of the secrets are far from obvious. And not all alternate routes necessarily take you to dash stages. For example, in Stage 2, you fight your way through another redux of the first stage of Castlevania, though you barely have time to wallow in nostalgia here, since your run through the Hall of Windows leading up to the Fishman Passage literally involves running, as you're chased by the corpse of a massive demonic bull, or at least the front half of it. The bull chase eventually peters out once you reach the second room, and the behemoth wrecks itself against a wall in its headlong rush, a trick you can also use to great effect against the Minotaur boss later in the game. However, if you stumble while being chased and fall into an open pit in the Hall of Windows, you'll drop into a space that looks almost exactly like the Fishman's lair, but isn't. Instead, it takes you to Stage 2 Dash. On the other hand, if you manage to grab the key hidden in one of the candles during the chase and stay on the main path, you can rescue Maria once you clear the bull run before moving on to the battle against the boss, the werewolf. The werewolf fight is interesting in that it nicely demonstrates the difference in design philosophy between Rondo of Blood and the X68000 remake of the original Castlevania that shipped a few months before Rondo. The werewolf fight here is tough, but ultimately manageable. The werewolf enemy can climb walls and perform aerial dashes toward Richter, and it can also fly into a spinning rage as it bounds up and down between the ceiling and floor. But you can kite the werewolf, lay down traps with holy water, and avoid it with deft maneuvering. Compare that to the absolute bastard of a werewolf on X68000, who's way more maneuverable than Simon, behaves unpredictably, and has the ability to dismantle a massive tower clock and chuck the pieces at Simon with infuriating accuracy. It's cool, but it feels like something from a different game altogether. And Rondo certainly has some tough battles, but it builds up to them. By the time you face death on the rotting masts of a haunted pirate ship, and he discards his scythe in order to pummel you with karate, it's near the game's end and you've already overcome the worst Dracula has to offer outside of the inevitable clock tower and its host of sine wave bastards. Again, Rondo walks a delicate balance between the other Castlevania games, combining the best of them and in a lot of ways embodying everything that made the TurboGrafx-16 and PC Engine so unique compared to other systems of the time. It's a hard game, but it arms you for the fight with versatility, unlike the X68000 game, which is just plain hard and kind of mean about it. It's less flashy than the Super NES game, but it nevertheless demonstrates technical excellence. The CD format enables Redbook audio and music, which includes great live instrumental performances of both old and new Castlevania music, along with full voice acting and tons of interesting audio clips like death cries and the creakiest door hinge ever recorded. The cutscenes are scattered few and far between, but they give the game some narrative grounding and make Castlevania's heroes and villains feel like characters for the first time, rather than just figures or avatars. And Maria and Richter have just as many skills as the Super NES version of Simon, but they're less unwieldy, and they don't render your subweapons mostly useless. Rondo's action feels a lot more fluid and lively than that of Bloodlines. In that respect, the two games seem to be of a kind with their respective platforms. I find turbo action games usually feel less stiff than Genesis games, and that's certainly true for Castlevania. And the less said about Rondo versus its eventual Super NES remake, or really demake, the better. Dracula X is not a bad game, but it strips out almost everything that made Rondo so compelling, from the hidden objectives and branching paths to the ability to play as Maria. I'm pretty sure Konami made Dracula X because they wanted to sell some form of Rondo to Americans, but they kind of went about it in the same way that they retooled Metal Gear for NES and took out most of the cool stuff. It looked and maybe even sounded better, but reviewers bagged on it hard at the time because, let's face it, it wasn't Rondo. It was a pretty okay Classicvania, simpler than even Bloodlines, as hard as the X68000 game, but back when Rondo was near impossible for Americans to play, even via emulation, it sure did feel like a mean-spirited kick to the skull. Whereas Rondo feels exactly like the kind of game you'd expect to find on a platform designed for people who really get nerdy about video games. It's a Castlevania packed with grace notes that you didn't find anywhere else. It's not just the hidden goodies and sprawling stage maps and replay-friendly stage map system. It's not just the whimsical secrets, like trying to item crash a key, or playing the game with the wrong system card inserted into the console. Rondo invests its entire world with personality and style, always managing to surprise players with unusual twists. Even things like enemy behaviors. Just about every bad guy has a few different behavior routines available. While playing a perfect speedrun will always cause them to react the same way, it's when you hang back or make mistakes that their personalities come out. Rondo was made by people who loved Castlevania and who loved making video games, and who loved the fans who played their games, and it really shows at every turn. A lot of this game feels like a dramatic action set piece. Rondo's level design philosophy sits somewhere between Strider and a treasure game, from that opening face-off with Death to the Behemoth chase and beyond. It's kind of like the team saw the Clockwork Mansion stage in Castlevania 4 and decided the whole game should contain stuff like that, but dialed back just a bit. Events like encountering the Boatman from Castlevania 2, or using a bomb to destroy a wall, are ultimately bonuses and just help you unlock more secrets. And the level layouts never feel stale or repetitive. For every standard design you encounter, like the castle halls or the clock tower, there are stranger levels, like the graveyard where dragon skeletons hide secrets, or the cathedral in its seemingly endless diagonal staircase. Good thing too, because Rondo demands you revisit these places, not just because you'll need to seek out secrets and alternate routes, but also because the bosses at the end of them can be pretty tough. Some can be defeated in a first attempt, but others may require a few do-overs. A lot of bosses have multiple phases too, like Carmilla, who returns from Castlevania 2. Originally a deeply pointless hovering mask that wept a single exploding tear, Carmilla now occupies a room in which a woman sits waiting in a chair as the mask rises. The mask shatters and reveals itself as a massive skull being clutched by a nude, feminine specter. She still weeps a tear from the skull, but it detonates into arcs of falling flame that fill the room. And once you defeat the skull, the specter flickers from existence, and the other woman, Carmilla's lover, Laura, leaps from her chair to become what I can only describe as a kung fu fighting version of Ney from Phantasy Star 2. The entirety of Rondo works like this, new ideas sitting alongside familiar Castlevania touchstones. And even the referential bits offer something new and exciting to the series. This carries forward all the way to the eventual face-off with Dracula, which Americans will recognize in reverse from the intro to Symphony of the Night, except that here you're meant to recognize it from the original Castlevania. You battle Dracula in human form as he warps around the room and throws fireballs. Upon his defeat, he transforms into a huge demon that breathes flames and leaps around the room. It's like the first game, but bigger and cooler and more exciting, and Hagiwara's team built on it directly a few years later to build Symphony of the Night, which was even bigger and cooler and much different from any Castlevania before it. All of these factors made the absence of Rondo of Blood in America and Europe sting all the more, at least until 2007, when I finally gave in, bought my own Turbo Duo and copy of Rondo, the most expensive video game purchase I had ever made, only for Konami to announce a PSP remake a couple of months later. You're all welcome for that. So as you celebrate Halloween this year, remember the reason for the season, Castlevania. And more to the point, the coolest Castlevania, and maybe the coolest TurboGrafx game, Rondo of Blood. Happy holidays. Next time on TurboWorks Gaiden, something a little less obvious, unless you frequent this channel, that is.